Hello, Kellie Austin, who is running for the Public Service Commission. I'm Trenton Adams. Welcome to the Cherokee County Republican Party candidate interviews, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your campaign to participate in this interview process. We've extended this invitation to all candidates in this race and sourced questions from the CCRP membership. We have found that it has been an asset for voters in making their decision. The video will appear on the Cherokee County GOP website and will be shared on social media. The interview will be shown unedited in its entirety. For the interview, we will ask you a number of questions but can offer no prompting. There are no right or wrong answers, only your answers. We ask each candidate the same questions. If this is all right with you, I'll have everyone introduce themselves and then I'll ask John to begin asking the questions.
Absolutely, thank you.
Cool, thanks.
I'm John Longshore.
Hey, John.
Larry Mrozins.
Tim Adderhold.
Harry Abrams.
All right.
Would you authorize an audit to determine if the deregulation of gas marketers has been beneficial to the consumer or merely added another cost tier?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would absolutely authorize an audit, but I think that even that may be a little bit limited. I get a lot of questions about or comments on that deregulation was a bad thing, and I think that it goes back to more than just the expenses that have been made, but looking at the regulations that were put in place and who set those regulations and what's been guaranteed in that. I think it would be a very difficult thing to audit because the only thing that's regulated is just the pipeline side that the PSC regulates of Atlanta Gas Light, not what the marketers do and what rates they set. So I think that would make for probably an impossible true audit because you're only auditing that one piece. But what I do understand is that the regulated side has maintained their profit level since deregulation and totally separated themselves from the responsibility of getting customers and maintaining customers. And so I think that what we really experienced was a limited deregulation. And you have to take that into account when looking at whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. So an audit would be a great idea, and you could do it on a limited level, but you have to realize you can't really audit what is being done on the marketing side because that's not covered by the PSC. We don't see their rates. We don't see really all the details of what's charged, but it's a really good concept for us to really look into and see where the benefits have been.
The preamble of the Republican platform states that a smaller, smarter government that keeps taxation, litigation, and regulation to a minimum will keep America grand and lead to a legacy of growth and prosperity. With that in mind, how does the regulation of the internet accomplish this? And second, how does regulation of the cable, cellular, and other markets accomplish this ideal?
Oh, I really like the question. Very good. You know, to start with, kind of my basis, my framework, I've been a Republican and a conservative for my entire life. My ideals and beliefs have developed over the years, but have always remained true to that same fiscal conservative base. And my platform is limited government, lower taxes, and more personal freedom. So kind of playing into that, the basis of what you just mentioned, the preamble, the standard that we adhere to, and yet often when it gets applied to specific issues, it gets really, really convoluted. And certainly comes into play when you talk about regulating anything, even regulating the gas or the electricity, which we are currently doing. Even with the deregulation of natural gas, it still is clearly a regulated entity at the same time. Anytime you bring regulation in, you increase government and you decrease the private sector. You decrease, free market competition. You decrease all the things that our platform says we stand for. So anytime you regulate anything, you are taking away from our freedoms that we are fighting for as Republicans. So for that basis, regulating the internet, regulating cellular, any of these things, I believe, is a negative. We're seeing a lot of regulations right now on the federal side. Those hurt the free market. There's nothing perfect. I'm not happy with my cell phone bill. I just got that today, and a couple of my kids turned their data, basically removed their limits and went over their data, and I'm paying for that. That's a free market reality. We have products and we pay for them, and we pay whatever the market demand says that it will take. And quite frankly, as Verizon keeps increasing my cost, I keep paying for it because I want that service enough that I'm willing to pay for it. And then, you know, I ground my kid when he goes over his data because I'm not willing to pay that much for it. You know, that's the free market. And that's where I believe we have got to stay when it comes to regulations of, you know, wireless, you know, cell phones, as you mentioned, and internet and these other aspects. We can't increase the regulation. It sounds nice because I'm not happy with my cell phone bill. I'm not happy with my cable bill. I'm not happy that I have to pay for channels that maybe I don't want to watch. But at the ultimate core base, we have to decide, what's our philosophy of government? Do I ultimately believe that more regulation, bigger government, more taxation, less competition is good for the consumer? Or do I believe that limited government, lower taxes, less regulation is good for the consumer? And that's where I land every time. We began monopolies, we began this whole regulatory process over 100 years ago, and there was really an economic concept or economic thought that believed that limiting competition would help the consumer. And I believe that over the past 100 years, we've disproven that economic theory, and we know that more competition ultimately helps the consumer. Now, it doesn't mean it will right away. We have, I mean, if you remember when the first VCRs came out, they were so expensive. I know because my dad bought one. I mean, we were not wealthy, but when it came to new technology, that was just absolutely his passion. He loved it. And then a few months later, they got cheaper and cheaper. And now, I mean, you can buy a VCR for what, 50 cents because you can only get them at yard sales. The market changes that, but if you come in and mandate it from the beginning, you disrupt the entire free market system. And another piece to the regulation of the internet that we've discussed just in the general commentary is regulating content as well as regulating the speeds and the accessibility of that. All of those pieces we have got to really stay away from, which is why I'm actually very supportive, ironically, of the FCC decision for net neutrality and to keep that where they cannot interfere on that level. And I absolutely oppose any regulation from the state level on wireless, cellular, internet, any of those cable, any of those aspects we're not currently regulating. I want us to see us limit government, pull away from subsidies as we're able to, not to increase those. And there is the recommendation of some running, my opponent in particular, who has stated that he wants to regulate internet, he wants to regulate all emerging technology, he wants the ability to levy fines and to set standards of service. And again, it sounds really good because I've lived in North Georgia. I've had some of these, cable and internet providers that your service is not always consistent. It's not always as fast as you want. But again, it comes down to, do I believe that setting a required standard, setting a service percentage or parameter, do I believe that's going to give better service? Or do I believe that's going to raise rates? And quite frankly, if they mandate a service level, they have to mandate that they can charge what it costs to provide that. That means consumer costs are going to go up. Do I support that because of a mandated level, not because of a market-driven demand? Absolutely not. Let's stay out of it. Leave it alone.
Much has been made of solar energy. Would you agree that this industry requires subsidies to continue to grow?
The solar industry has been completely dependent upon subsidies, both federal subsidies and state subsidies. I think we've gotten away from some of our state subsidies. I detest subsidies on a principled level. I know that we have subsidies. We have them in many other areas besides solar, certainly a lot of the renewable energies and our farming and many other things. Ultimately, I want to see us pull away from subsidies whenever possible. Do I believe that subsidies are required to grow the solar industry? I really don't. Any industry that the market can support does not require subsidies. Now, there are times we decide that tax credits and other things are helpful to encourage an industry that's perhaps not growing as fast as we want it to grow, but we have to be really, really careful that we're not supporting an industry that doesn't have a basis in the market without those subsidies. I think that the subsidies that we have right now on the federal level for solar is why we're seeing solar grow. I know that solar has got more subsidies in South Carolina than we have here in Georgia, and I know companies in Georgia that are focused on business in South Carolina because of those solar subsidies. And I'm glad for them to go over there and get that business. But I don't want to see us increase that here because that's just increasing a level of taxation that we don't need. I'm pro-solar energy, but I'm pro-implementing it where it's fiscally responsible. We have some of our EMCs here in Georgia, Walton EMC, for example, that they're putting out solar panels and renting or more or less leasing those to their customers, and they cannot keep up with customer demand who want those solar panels. But that's a market-driven process. There's no mandate, there's no tax basis. That's where the market wants something and they're meeting that demand, and I support that completely. What I don't support is where on a state level we are mandating a certain level of production of really any kind of energy that isn't fiscally responsible. That doesn't make sense. And what we have in Georgia, unfortunately, is we are locked into 20-year contracts paying significantly more for solar than it even costs to make that solar today. And if you ask my opponent the question just the right way, he will admit that we are locked into these contracts paying double up to quadruple what it costs to make that solar energy today because the price has dropped. He refers to Germany and where they've gotten themselves into such a bind for committing to the cost of renewable energy on the early side of that technology and paying so much more than waiting until those costs begin to drop. And he specifically says that, Georgia's not going to get stuck in that kind of a locked situation, but the reality is we already have. We maybe not be the earliest adopter, but we're still way up here on the top of the bell curve. Those prices are continuing to drop, but we're not really to a point where it's supported by the market across the board. And that's the reason why Georgia Power did not include solar in their 20-year plan a couple of years ago. They had solar and they offered it to their customers, but their customers weren't buying it because it was more expensive. They changed that and brought in the ASI program because of the pressure from some of the public service commissioners. And when they first brought that project up, there was a much more market-driven piece to it that they removed before it was put into effect. So what we have is a subsidized solar mandate in Georgia that states we will have a certain amount of solar production, and it may be competitive to some dubious extent on the front end, but that's only competitive amongst who's even competing for it, not really what the market cost is for that. And that's simply not fiscally responsible. I don't believe that government, the Public Service Commission, which is charged with ensuring safe, reliable energy to every Georgian, I don't believe it's their job, our job, to get involved in the research and technology phase. That's what we have UGA for, Georgia Tech for. Actual research facilities that can perfect technology, and then when it makes sense financially, then we can bring it on, but not from a subsidy standpoint.
Would you agree with the statement, in a free market, if an industry can't survive without a subsidy, I would not support it?
Okay, let me make sure I heard you right. In a free market?
In a free market, if an industry can't survive without a subsidy, I would not support it.
As a general principle, absolutely. There might be some points where there's some reason why some limited subsidies make sense. But I would say no, because your question is really if it will not survive. Did not you say survive in there?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very different from starting something off. There is a point where it can make sense to have some subsidies, tax credits, tax incentives to start a market off. But I believe that if that market cannot survive on its own without subsidies, then no, by nature, it's a contradiction to say a subsidy is required to survive in a free market. Those two are contradictive terms. So no, it doesn't make sense, and I wouldn't support that. And that really goes to play not a PSC issue, but very around the situation with the tax credit for the electric vehicles that was sunsetted last year by the legislature. My opponent lobbied against that. He really pressured the legislator to keep that subsidy in place that he's benefiting from, and a handful of Georgians are. But the reality is that was a tax that every Georgian was paying for a limited number of people to access. And the interesting thing about that is, that was put in place by Governor Zell Miller 17 years earlier. And when he put that tax credit, that subsidy in place, there was no electric car that existed that you could use the tax credit on. So he put a tax credit in place to motivate an industry that really didn't even exist yet. And that was the reason for it. I think it actually probably went a little bit longer than it should have, because when people begin depending on that, then for the industry to survive, what you just said, then it's gone too long. It should be to encourage the industry, not to maintain it.
Would you reject any attempts by the Georgia House or Senate representatives to block elected PSC representatives from shielding Georgians from power company rate hikes?
Oh my goodness, read that question one more time, please.
Would you reject any attempts by Georgia House or Senate representatives to block elected Public Service Commission representatives from shielding Georgians from power company rate hikes?
You have several negatives in there. I'm trying to sort that out. So in essence, you're saying would I try to protect the consumers from rate hikes? But you can't clarify that exactly, can you? Okay, would I block from the legislature preventing PSC from shielding? All I can say is I would never stop anyone from protecting consumers from rate hikes. That is absolutely the basis for the PSC. The Public Service Commission was started back in the 1800s and serves at the pleasure of the legislature. We're an entity that was created by the legislature for the express purpose of ensuring safe, reliable, and reasonably priced electricity, natural gas, and telecommunications. So it is the job of the PSC to protect the consumer, to be the advocate for the consumer. It's not the PSC's job to be an advocate or a representative for the utilities. They're the ones that are there to put a line in the sand and say, you can do this and you can do this to ensure you can afford to provide these services, but there has to be a line drawn where it's protecting the consumer. And it's a balance, and it's why monopolies and it's why regulating of private companies is such a tricky thing, and why, frankly, I think we need to move away from that, because it doesn't fit well with the free market. Because you're trying to stop a company from doing things that in any other market is up to them to do based off of what the market will demand. But because the regulation, the Public Service Commission essentially becomes an artificial version of market demand, and they have to protect against those rate hikes. And that's why, of my reasons for running, I've got my 3 points commitments that I make, and my third commitment is to publicize every rate increase and to offer an electronic format, a website for response and input from the consumers. Because before a rate increase is voted on, that should be presented to people. They should know about it and have the ability to discuss that. And I was told by one person that there's no way that makes sense because these rates are just too complicated. The average voter wouldn't understand it, and it's not feasible. And I reject that, because we are an elected government where we elect our peers to represent us. We elect each of ourselves. So nothing is too complex for the rest of us to understand. Now, something may be my expertise, or maybe your expertise or your expertise, but collectively, this is all our expertise. One of us is not better than the other one. So I believe that we must put that information out there and get that involvement and that response for every rate increase. And that's why we've seen our energy costs go up 25% in the last 6 years since my opponent has been in office. And that has to change. The cost of producing energy is going down. We can't allow the cost to the consumer to continue to rise. It just does not make financial sense.
Weighing the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster in Japan and the evidence of tritium-contaminated groundwater from Indian Point in Buchanan, New York, how do you propose to protect Georgia residents from similar health threats?
I think a couple of the issues are a little separated from what happened in Japan quite some time ago. And even with the groundwater issues, I'm not a water expert. I won't pretend to be. That's when we have experts to weigh into those issues. At this point, Georgia has got some of the cleanest water in the nation. Not to say there are not issues to keep on top of. And there are some things that the EPD is looking into right now as far as water quality goes with some of the, not so much the nuclear waste, but some of the other plants and things that Georgia Power runs. So that's an ongoing issue to watch out for. But again, that's the ongoing responsibility of you know, the EPD, the Environmental Protection Department, which is the Georgia Department, and the Public Service Commission. Everything that we do has an impact, and we have to balance the impact of what we do with the livelihood of our economy and the people who live here. You know, we can say that everything has some kind of a negative impact, from cutting down a tree to changing water quality, but ultimately you either believe that we are here destroying the earth or we're here making the earth better, and that's a philosophical difference as well. We have to balance what we do, but I don't believe that the water quality issues are a reason to, at the outset, in a very generic sense, to pursue or not pursue any energy production. Specifically when you're referring to the water quality from nuclear, which the whole point of nuclear is it does not have excessive, you know, emissions or issues to the environment, but it does have the process of using a lot of water and having some water quality issues when it goes out from there. But if you look at the fact that they take the dirty water to begin with to use through the process that isn't usable, that we don't want to drink, and the filtering process that goes through, I think that we're already implementing all, maybe not all, but an enormous amount of standards required. And the reality is, the closer you get to home to put any regulations, the safer you are, because no one wants their water dirty. No one wants their air dirty. So when you keep those regulations and decisions local and close to home, I mean, that's the best way to protect anyone. Because I don't want, I mean, it's the whole not in my backyard, because you want your backyard clean. So what happens in Japan or even New York to that extent is so separate, because we are going to make good decisions to keep our water and our backyard clean in that sense.
Electrical smart meters emit microwave energy that some studies suggest may represent a health risk to the home or business occupants. Should Georgia residents be informed of possible smart meter risks and how to mitigate them?
I don't have a smart meter on my home, so I haven't experienced it on a personal level. I know that anytime I receive any equipment, whether it's something I've purchased or whether it's something that, you know, my cable provider sends to me, they always provide with me, you know, the list of possible negatives. And I would expect, and certainly should come with a smart meter or anything like that, any, you know, official documentation for what the side effects can be. I would say, to be realistic, that the microwave level radiation emissions from a smart meter is probably not of the greatest concern that anyone might have with a smart meter, because 99.9% of us have microwaves in our home to begin with. And we have, I mean, that was the big concern of cell phones back when they were first coming out, is, oh, you better not hold them up to your ear because you're going to end up with brain cancer because of the, you know, the radiation that they emit. And I'm not certain we've seen a lot of correlation to that. So I think that, like anything, again, there's negatives to whatever you do. And I'm not saying there are not some concerns with smart meters, but I don't think it's specifically in the emissions that that meter on the outside of the house is necessarily going to have. Folks have other concerns with what that's relaying as far as, you know, privacy information and such. That is certainly worth, you know, taking into consideration. But give people adequate warning, and anyone should have the right to opt in or opt out of anything that impacts their home whenever possible. And I would say that would certainly relate to smart meters as well. One of the pieces that comes with a smart meter, or where we've talked about going with that and other states are doing it, is where you're paying for electricity not as a flat rate, but really as a time of use. And things like that make a lot of sense. You know, I am going to pay more for electricity to run my air conditioning in the summertime when I'm dying. I grew up without air. I mean, I grew up as a Georgia girl, and I remember those days with no air conditioning, so I want my air conditioning. And those are the things that something like a smart meter can bring. And frankly, that can be very viable and make a lot of sense, and most businesses are moving to that kind of a concept. But there are pros and cons to weigh, and we have to evaluate those and make decisions as a, you know, as a community.
Will you fight for rate decreases for Georgians?
I will fight to, yeah, absolutely. And even more than decreases specifically, what I will look to do and look to fight for is to cut out when we are paying for things we shouldn't be paying for, paying twice for things we should only be paying once for, and cutting out just the junk in the middle. there are so many areas, and we see this in every business, every government agency office. There's always things that you can cut out and streamline and just make cleaner. We definitely have that when it comes to the rates and the fees, when it to the the regulated utilities. That's what I want to look at. Not just saying, okay, I'm going to cut everyone's rates 5% or whatever. That I think that's a pie in the sky, very easy answer that doesn't really meet reality. But looking at some of the things, such as the fuel charges, where we are really paying twice for some of the same things. The PSC has addressed some of those and limited some of the hedging and such that's been allowed with Georgia's money. I think more of that has to be taken into consideration. I think we have to look at the fact of what percentage of rate of returns that we're allowing for some of these investments. That is very, very high. I know that, again, the PSC brought those down from some of where they were requested to be, but it was still increases. And I'm not sure some of those increases make sense when we're guaranteeing rates of return for the company side and not necessarily guaranteeing protected rate cost to the consumer.
How would you avoid the appearances of conflicts of interest?
Good one. There will always be some appearance of conflict of interest because everything in the world is relationship based. Everything is relational, and we can't ignore that when it comes to the political world because we're still people and we talk and we relate, and there is relationship aspects. What I do think is of huge concern is when you begin to see anyone in elected office beginning to support issues kind of out of the blue they've never really shown any interest in, and then seeing direct correlations to financial benefits or financial support, donations and such. I think that's just always a red flag. And I would say that it's something that you have just to guard against. Who you're taking money from, when you're taking that money, and being very transparent about it so that you're avoiding those conflicts of interest. And that transparency is probably one of the biggest key issues, is being very, very open with everything that you're doing. That's a tricky thing because when you're running for office, they have made the financial disclosures much more transparent and invasive than they've ever been before on the state level. That changed this year, and I was really surprised at some things that asked to be disclosed from mine that's never been asked of other offices before. I think it's invasive, but it's essential, because when you're in public office, you've chosen to put yourself in a position of transparency, and it's why not everyone wants to run. And I mean, it's kind of a creepy thing a little bit to realize what you're putting out in the open of your financial situation, but that's the only way to really be transparent. But even with that, unfortunately it still requires the candidate or the elected official to be genuine, because if you're not being genuine, there's really no way to guarantee it or to validate that. They don't go into your actual bank accounts and check and see if the numbers you put down were accurate. So it makes it very difficult. My intention is to always be very open with who's supporting me, where my support comes from. That's the foundation. And to be very clear of what I'm supporting and why to begin with, so that down the road, even if there's a correlation that someone has supported my campaign or is a personal friend, and you can see, well, that's something that Kellie's always said. She's for limited government, lower taxes, personal freedom. So the fact that she's, supporting reducing rates or a free market process, well, those just make sense regardless of what other pieces are attached to that. And I think it comes down to being consistent to those issues and to those values. And if you are, the reality is that your support is going to tend to follow that also. I'm so pleased that I just received the support of the Georgia Real Estate Political Action Committee, because our values tend to align. That makes sense. I'm open to say that. Yes, they've supported me. I'm so proud to have that, because property rights, that's intrinsic to who we are as Americans. And any way that the utilities and the Public Service Commission interacts with private property rights and ownership rights, I'm going to be all over that to ensure that we're protecting private property rights, because that's what America was founded on. I believe it just comes down to being transparent and being very open to answer questions and to being saying yes, you know, and even on that, it's getting away as much as possible from the PSC having the ability to directly affect businesses that are benefiting from their decisions. The more that that process becomes open. I have a huge concern with the solar program right now through Georgia Power because there is no public record of the companies that are bidding on that process, what they're paying for those bids, and who is winning those bids. That right there is a lack of transparency. You can see from some of the records of who have won bids and conversations of who's won and whose campaigns they're supporting, and those raise major red flags. But the lack of seeing the rest of that process makes me really concerned of how truly transparent and free market and properly conveyed that whole competitive process is.
I received a landowner notification from a water company by certified mail. What does it mean?
A landowner
Notification.
from a water company. I'm not really certain, and the Public Service Commission does not regulate water. So I really don't have a great answer for you. I can speculate, but honestly, it'd just be speculation, and I would prefer to avoid that. I will say that should I ever deal with anything that has a landowner notification from a water company, I would research it from experts in the water and utility department before I made any answer. And that's the brilliant thing about anyone in public office, quite frankly. We don't have to be experts in every area. We're able to call on experts in whatever area that is.
Thank you.
Often tax increases are passed on to utility customers under the guise of fees for the purpose of supporting other government expansion programs. Will you work to eliminate any utility fees?
Love the way you phrased that, because I made a statement not too long ago saying that my opponent has voted for every rate increase and every tax increase since he's been in office. And someone came back and said, well, he hasn't voted for any tax increases because the Public Service Commission does not have taxing authority. I said, well, brilliant answer, but whether you call something a rate or a tax, unfortunately, is just really up to the terms you decide to use. Technically, a tax is kind of what you refer to. It's something that supports infrastructure, whereas a rate is what supports or pays for a service that's provided to a customer. And we honestly see both of those in what the Public Service Commission supports. You know, the $6.9 billion that the Public Service Commission recently voted unanimously for one company was for infrastructure improvements. And when that was voted on, they had not even really defined what that infrastructure looked like. I mean, it kind of relates to me to the health care bill. You know, you can read the bill once it passes. Those are exactly the what you refer to as rates that are more or less really taxes. When you have to pay something to get a service you have to have, whether you call it a rate, a fee, or a tax, it kind of really is just semantics at that point. And that is where we have got to be very, very careful. Because infrastructure, those are the golden handcuffs that lock us into the monopolies. Infrastructure is what we guarantee and have a legal liability to the companies to ensure that they get their investment back with significant rate of return, which is very different from ensuring that a customer has access to energy, that we're seeing you getting the paying for the cost of you producing energy. When you're talking about purchasing, investing in building and maintaining infrastructure, that's very, very different. And you can have a huge, wonderful building infrastructure, but if it's not producing anything, it's just a burden. And we're seeing that right now with the coal plants. You know, my opponent voted to close 16 coal plants in Georgia. And the reality is, when they close those coal plants, Georgia, the state of Georgia, taxpayers, the ratepayers, whatever you want to call it, are legally liable to continue to pay for that coal plant, even after it's closed, and to pay for the profit, the energy it could have produced had it remained open, because of the commitment we've made to that infrastructure investment. So that's where I mean to say, do I want to eliminate fees? Again, that's a semantic of the term. What we have to do is stop supporting the investments that aren't directly related to the service that's being provided. And that's a hard issue, and it's one that's a lot of times not popular because everyone wants everything provided for them. One of the people running for this office has made the comment that subsidies are the only way that we can get what we want. Subsidies are the only way that we can get the infrastructure that we need. You know, that certain counties cannot afford the infrastructure that they need to upgrade their services and the things they want to provide to their citizens. But we're all paying for those subsidies. Just because you call it a subsidy or say it's tax money you're coming out of this fund, that's our money that we've put into it. And we have to decide who we want to be the ones paying for that and owning that. And if we're investing in something, but that another company ends up owning, that's really a strange situation. I mean, we see that right now down in Savannah with a plant that was closed, and now one of the regulated utilities is giving that plant that we had closed to another entity. But taxpayers paid for that because it's a very strange situation. And I think we have to really start evaluating who owns what and what should government be owning, what should private businesses be owning, and separating those two a little bit.
Do you believe the cost of utilities is too high in Georgia? And if so, how would you plan to reduce them?
You'll probably hear that Georgia has some of the lowest rates in the nation. We're not in a bad place. I think we're number 27 out of 50. So we are a little bit below average. But if you look at any expert's commentary, Georgia should have some of the best energy rates in the nation. So in that sense, I don't think we're doing anywhere near as good as we should be doing. And I think if you look at some of the things that we are paying for, such as these subsidized renewable energies, such as the cost overruns at Plant Vogtle, these different aspects, clearly, those are going into our rate expenses. And to say that they're not is simply delusionary. In that sense, our rates should be lower than they are. And by beginning to cut out some of those excesses, really tightening up on who is overseeing and managing some of these projects, then we will begin to cut out and lower the rates, at least lower them beyond where inflation would take them. I believe it was projected that our electricity rates, for example, would increase at 1% per year. That was the projection made by the utility company a handful of years ago, well, 6 years ago, which means as of today we should be at 6% higher. Instead, we're at 25% higher. Those are huge concerns. And I know we talk a lot about Plant Vogtle and the cost overruns and the mandates that force that, but then you look over at South Carolina, and they started their project, their nuclear project, after we did, and yet they are ahead of schedule and under budget. I believe they're ahead of our schedule, even though starting much later than us. Those are decisions that we made as a state that we can't unmake those decisions for the current project, but we can really start making some serious thought about what we do the next time. We accepted these federal loan guarantees for this project and determined that that was essential. When we did that, we handcuffed ourselves to federal mandates that South Carolina is not required to comply with. For example, Plant Vogtle can only use union labor. And by standard, that's about 40% more than non-union labor. Does that make sense to Georgia ratepayers? I'm not sure that it does. So again, we can't undo decisions we've made, but we can start making more fiscally sound decisions as we move forward. And I am very, very glad, and it will definitely, give kudos to Georgia Power. They did just, and I forget the name of the company, too many in my head, but the contractor over the South Carolina plant has just been brought on and is now running and managing Plant Vogel's construction. That is a fantastic move. They have really, really displayed themselves as being very financially sound, making some good management decisions. Again, we can't change things like having to use union labor, which is so bizarre in a right-to-work state, but that is what it is when you accept those federal handcuffs of subsidies, quite frankly. And that's all a loan guarantee is. It's another form of a subsidy.
In your opinion, what is the most viable form of alternative energy that should be developed in Georgia?
Whatever the market can support, whatever can be begun, grown, and maintained by market demand without subsidies, without tax credits, without tax incentives. And quite frankly, I don't know what that might be. I mean, I hear one of my opponents talking about the CHP program and talking about grass and encouraging our farmers to change to switch grass, which is a subsidy-based product, and turning into new forms of renewable energy, which are all subsidy-based programs. I do not support those. We've got to get away from subsidies and certainly not be encouraging our farmers to get into new subsidies that the market doesn't support. I would say it's probably not wind. I definitely, from research, it shows that it's not financially viable. I know we are buying wind now from Oklahoma and bringing it over here. Lot of loss in that process, and they've not shown that it's economically viable. My opponent will say it is because he brings into play the jobs that it creates. But creating jobs is not government's job. And if you create a job and you pay to create a job, then that's still cost to the taxpayers. I mean, unemployment, if we want to call it that, then we'd say every person who's unemployed and getting unemployed benefits, we just gave them a job. That doesn't make sense. If taxpayers' money is paying for something above and beyond the cost of that, of what the market would demand that to be, then those are just taxes. We can't count jobs as a benefit when we're paying that above the cost of the service. And it gets a little tricky, and it sounds like, oh no, you're against jobs. No, I'm for jobs that the market supports, not increasing everyone's taxes and rates just to say we're going to create a new job out of that. And I'm not certain what renewable form that is. It will be, and solar probably is where it's going to be eventually. You know, the studies do show that Georgia, out of all 50 states, Georgia probably has the most potential for solar energy of any state in the nation. But we've got to, and we're seeing a lot of refinements. You know, the programs that were developed at University of Georgia and being implemented now have drastically increased the productivity of the solar panels. We're seeing a lot of research and development in the battery and storage side. Those things are coming. I don't believe it should be done through the Public Service Commission. Let the free market push that, but those are coming, and I will be super excited when we get to that point, because I truly believe that Georgia should be in a position to not only have some of the lowest rates in the nation, we should be in a position to export our energy to other states. And that's something that has been an interesting question. People have been concerned that some of the energy produced by our plants in Georgia is going to other states. That's a good thing, because if it goes to other states, they're paying for it. And that's coming into that same base of to pay for the infrastructure and such. I believe that we should be getting to the point of where we're exporting as much and as far and wide as we can. And I want to see that as much as possible in the private sector, in private businesses, beginning to maximize on that growing aspect of our economy.
What is your plan to make the public more aware of the role of the Public Service Commission and how it affects utilities in Georgia?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, Harry. And I'll just kind of go back to my 3 commitments. And these are things that I really discovered in this process that I never would have realized weren't existing already. You know, and that's why folks don't know much about the Public Service Commission. And the first is the PSC does not currently record their votes. And so my first commitment is to make every vote of the Public Service Commission recorded and searchable, just like the legislature. And I've had my opponent, he may tell you that I'm incorrect, that they do record those, but I have the letter from the attorney of the Public Service Commission in response to my Freedom of Information request that states, I'm sorry, Ms. Pollard or Ms. Austin, we can't respond to that request because we don't actually keep and record the votes of the Public Service Commissioners on specific issues. So that's the first thing, is to make that information available to start with, and where you can go back and find it if you want to find it. The second piece is to make every public hearing, public meeting of the Public Service Commission live streamed, just like we do in the legislature. They have an audio feed now, and I'm sure it works sometimes, but I have never logged on and found that link to work. Even sitting in the hearing room, watching the hearing live, I've not been able to get those links to work. And if you go back and look at the archive links, about maybe 1 in 10 of the meetings have a link that works. Either they're not there or it goes to just a dead link that doesn't exist anymore. There are a few that are there. I'm not saying they aren't, but that's not sufficient. We should have a live stream where you can see the commissioners, you can see who's speaking, you can see who's in the room and who's not, and you can hear what's going on. The third piece is to, as I mentioned before, to publicize every rate increase, to put on the website every rate increase that's being recommended, and to allow for a response to that. Those aspects will immediately begin to increase awareness. Everything on the web, as you search, you can find these pieces if they're out there to find. Right now, anyone who's searching for information on energy is not going to find a lot of that because it's not available. And then it's just the ongoing process of conversation with people. You know, as I've traveled around the state and talked to, gosh, I guess tens of thousands of people in the last year, I've had so many conversations and people saying, wow, I had no idea the PSC existed or did that. So I believe it's that just ongoing, continuing conversation, meeting with folks around. I've talked to so many cities and county officials who obviously know the PSC exists, but say they've had little to no interaction with the commissioners. I've met a few that were in the Capitol for other events and said, well, you're the first person I've ever met from the or I'm not from the PSC yet, but the first person I've ever met running for or with the PSC, so you've got my vote right now because I've never even met anyone before. Those things need to change just from the focused interaction with them throughout the state.
Are you currently a member of your local Republican Party?
I am I think it's called a G-Circle member right now. It's kind of our next level up in Gwinnett County, and I've been a member of the Gwinnett County Republican Party for a couple of years. I've been an active Republican, well, since I was 19. That was when 20 years ago. This month, I was elected as the youngest delegate in the nation to the 1996 Republican National Convention, and that same year, I was elected as the secretary of the Stevens County Republican Party. And so active throughout those years. There were a few years I was not an active party member when I was doing some campaigns and things and pulled back from some of the active party involvement, just the conflict. But I don't believe I've ever missed a vote, to my knowledge, since my first vote when I was 19. I do say that my first vote was in 3rd grade for Ronald Reagan in elementary school, but I know that one didn't really count. And of course, that's an interesting comparison to one of the individuals who's running who has never voted in a Republican primary yet. But yes, absolutely, I'm a member and been pretty involved for a while.
I'll go ahead and get the last three. We would like our elected Republican leaders to help us grow the party. Please briefly describe any significant efforts you have made in the past to support the Republican Party and or Republican candidates locally, statewide, or nationally.
Wow, that's a really good question. All right. Well, as I mentioned, I was the youngest national delegate in '96 and was just so thrilled and honored to be allowed that position. I was a delegate in 2004 as well. I was the secretary of the Stevens County Republican Party and then later the vice chairman and then the chairman. I was the chairman of the Republican Party in Stevens County when we went from a majority Democrat to a majority Republican county. And what I did was recruiting and training local people to run for local office for county commission and school board and all those different offices. During that same time, I was the area director for the 9th District of the Republican Party under Charlie Norwood before he passed away, and served through those. I had 7 counties through North Georgia that I worked with, and again, recruiting and training candidates, helping local people, put on a lot of events, candidate forums, which now I really understand the significance of it. I'm so glad I was able to do that back in 2004 and those different years. Gosh. Then during the 10 years that I was married, my whole outside of having kids and homeschooling my kids at the time, everything I did was really around the Republican Party with candidates and events. Oh, in 2004, with the re-election of George W. Bush, I had they had the Bash for Bush, that may be before your years, but I was very surprised to find out that I actually had the largest Bash for Bush in the state and was invited down to meet the president in Atlanta when he came through after that event. So a lot of those kinds of events. And then after that, when I moved to Atlanta, I became a consultant running campaigns, recruiting and helping to elect good conservative ethical Republicans to office, and have worked for a number of the legislators and judges and county commissioners and county chairmen around the state. So.
And have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime excluding traffic offenses?
Have I ever been arrested? I've been arrested. I've never been convicted of a crime.
And have you ever been the subject of professional discipline or cited for breach of ethics or unprofessional conduct by any disciplinary committee, court, administrative agency, or other professional group?
No.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the...
I would just say that my name is Kellie Pollard Austin. I'm an 8th generation Georgian. So I've been around for a while. I've lived in almost every corner of the state. So this state matters to me, and that's really the why I'm running. It's not because of one energy agenda or because of one desire or focus to achieve or accomplish any initiative of my own, other than that this is my state. I have 5 kids. I hope they all stay in Georgia. I hope that we can keep Georgia as a strong economy, because energy is the foundation of our economy. And as the rest of the nation and the world is going to heck in a handbasket, if we can be solid and strong in Georgia and independent from a lot of the federal mandates and subsidies, then it doesn't matter what happens to everyone else. We can remain strong and solid and continue to have an economy and a state that's based on limited government, lower taxes, and more personal freedom, the foundation of why we started this nation to begin with. I'm an absolute believer in states' rights and in what was created initially with the state sovereignty. That's really about it. And then, my website is votekellie.com, and the only thing you have to remember there is that Kellie is with an IE, so it's votekellie, KELLIE.com. And I would ask for to really dig into this, because this is so important to your personal budget, your financial budget, and even more than that, the things, the values that the people you elect to office to represent you, it really matters. And what someone says they're going to do or try to do, even if they're not able to do that in the office they're seeking, listen to what they say, because that gives you insight into who they are, what really matters to them. And that's so important. I think we're seeing that now with looking at things that our legislature is passing and is not even being signed into law. We must look at what our elected officials say they want to do, what their values they support, and to make those decisions on every position on the ballot, whatever that is, even if it's something that you don't think matters to you, the person you're electing matters very, very much to your life, and to take responsibility for those decisions. With that, thank you so much for having this. I'm just absolutely honored and proud that you've done this, and thank you again.
Thank
you
you.
very much.
Yeah.